This is the Cooler Master NCORE 100 Max. It's an ITX case we're reviewing today, and it comes with a swappable top panel, which is kind of interesting. We actually have one of the alternative configurations set up right here, where the swappable top allows it to become either smaller or larger. This one's larger, and going larger allows it to fit this video card in an ITX case. And the card itself sort of becomes structural once you put it in there. We'll show you that later. So the swappable top panel allows you to fit larger GPUs, or you can go with the smaller variant. And then the panels, side panels, are made out of aluminum. They pop out like that. There's an interesting central spine up here on the front of the case, depending on your orientation, and we'll pop that out in a second. But that comes out to allow better access to the system and to also allow that reconfigurable component. So top panel comes off like that, reveals the next feature, which is actually a thick radiator. That's a 38mm thick radiator they pre-install. And then this spine pops out like this, where now it's out of the way, but also allows the reconfiguration. So this case is really interesting. We're going to be reviewing it today. We're doing thermals, acoustics, and of course looking at the build quality and the actual building process for it. And the price seems higher than maybe it is in reality, because it comes with a cooler and a power supply. Total cost $400, making it the most expensive ITX case we've reviewed. But case here is in air quotes, because once you take out the cost of the power supply and the cooler, it comes down a little bit. So we'll talk about that as well. So the NCORE 100 Max has a relatively small footprint just in terms of the actual square area, but it's tall. It's a pretty large tower. It's a Mini-ITX tower, basically. And it's more similar in some ways to the NZXT H1 for layout and for the general form factor of it, although Cooler Masters is taller still. And hopefully Cooler Masters also doesn't catch on fire like NZXT's did originally. One of the traditional downsides with doing a tower layout for an ITX case is if they invert or rotate the motherboard at all, you can end up with the I/O really inaccessible, like at the bottom of the case, for example. And what Cooler Master did for layout was basically a vertical sandwich. So they've got the motherboard on one side, the video card's on the back of this, and the power supply sits above it. It exhausts its air up and out through the shared radiator. And then the motherboard ends up in a normal orientation. So we've got the PCIe slot at the bottom just with a riser. And that means that the I/O ends up at effectively the same back of the case as you would normally have. So that remains accessible, but the GPU ends up with its display out at the bottom. So that's routed underneath in this channel, which you can see they've got channel kind of grooved out here, and we've got the front panel connectors routed up and in, and then the display out would come out here and route out the side. The Max part of the name here is because it comes with other parts, so there's not a non-Max version of this case right now. Cooler Master had the NR200P Max previously, which also came with additional components. And so the parts that comes with the 120mm liquid cooler, normally a 120 CLC would be concerning because it's just not that powerful, and we typically would recommend that you instead use an air cooler, because almost all air coolers we would recommend in the $30 plus range will outperform a 120mm CLC these days. The reason this one gets by is because they have a thicker radiator at the 38mm thickness we mentioned earlier, and that's why it can still handle it. It's got the extra surface area and ability to deal with the heat. So you can see, as far as radiators go, this is relatively large. I'm going to go grab a more standard one for comparison. Radiator. So this extremely healthy looking radiator smells of propylene glycol, first of all, so either it was leaked on or it is leaking. But this is a more standard thickness, at least by older definitions of radiator thickness, and that difference is exactly why this 120 is, there's more hope for it in our thermal testing than a standard thickness. It's a big impact for the cooling performance. It's actually the same approach that Arctic took with the Liquid Freezer 2 as well, and it's part of the reason that series was so competitive when it came out. Power supply is an 850 watt power supply. It has a native 12 volt high power cable. We'll talk more about this cable later in the video, but one of the things that we really didn't like was just how bent it ends up being to get the GPU installed in this position. You can see that is a massive bend, a little bit more risk of pulling this thing, and we already know how sensitive 12 volt high power connectors are to being as socketed as possible, and the cable quality is also a higher concern due to how close it is to the spec. So we'll be going over that in a little bit, and those are the two parts that they include with the case. The included CLC and power supply drive the price up to that $400 mark, $380 at the time of writing, and removing the typical price of a cooler and a power supply from the total cost, the price of the case itself is more like $170 to $180 to the consumer. That's on par with the Fractal Terra and just above the Lian Li Dan case A4H2O. It's less expensive than boutique cases like the N-Case M1 Evo or the Form D T1. The obvious downside is that you're forced into using the two parts they provide. So if for some reason they're not desirable, there's really no great compromise with this, or you just end up wasting a lot of money on parts you won't use. The case also comes with a single 120mm exhaust fan high on the rear panel. This helps get some of the hot air from the GPU out before it makes it to the radiator up top. And theoretically, it helps on the motherboard side as well, but it's heavily blocked by the power supply. The NCORE 100 Max also has a focus on toolless mechanisms, only requiring use of a screwdriver for the motherboard and the GPU in standard configuration. The expanded configuration makes the case wider to allow for those thicker GPUs. Those include the likes of the Sapphire Nitro Plus RX 7900 XTX, or even the gigantic Gigabyte Aorus Master RTX 4080 with a little more tweaking. We tested each of these GPUs and they do technically fit, although you'll become increasingly thermally constrained as the space inside of the enclosure continues to get filled by larger cards. The NCORE 100 Max is the kind of case that makes proponents of the footprint metric really excited. As compared to more traditionally oriented cases like the Fractal Terra, the NCORE 100 Max doesn't take up very much desk surface area at all, but it's a relatively imposing monolith. It measures 212mm long by 155mm wide in normal mode. The case is 481mm tall though, meaning it's taller than the other ITX cases we've reviewed are long. This brings the volume to 15.7 liters in standard mode. We measured the case ourselves, as we always do, and got actually the exact same numbers as advertised. That holds true when the case is set up in expanded mode as well, where the width increases to 172 millimeters and the volume goes to 17.5 liters. The Cooler Master earns the distinction here of being the first ITX case we've looked at that doesn't screw around with protrusions on the case and whether or not they should be excluded from volumetric measurements. So part of that may be because there aren't many protrusions on this case, but nonetheless, Cooler Master gets congratulations here for not lying on the spec sheet. That's going to be our new award we give, the Not Lying on the Spec Sheet award. Although maybe they're just atoning for the whole H500p thing. Today we are looking at the Cooler Master H500p. Okay, we're not gonna... Overall, the NCORE 100 Max is easy to build in and the manual is pretty good. The exterior panels are removed just by pulling and are attached to the case with push pins, which give a stable hold. They're made of 2mm thick aluminum that's perforated with holes and bent into shape, and there's a metal mesh attached to the interior side of the panels with plastic pieces that just pull off to allow for the fine mesh to be removed for cleaning. The top panel is made of plastic for the actual panel structure and is covered in a rigid metal mesh. So it looks like one of those fine mesh panels you would get on the front of, say, a Fantex ATX case, where they use that really fine mesh material. Works great because it eliminates the need for a dust filter, but is super breathable despite having just a ton of tiny holes in it. Now the problem with those fine mesh panels is that they're normally relatively flimsy. On the front of a big ATX case doesn't matter because it's not like it's really a structural component. This case, it's very important that the top panel is pretty rigid because it is holding everything structurally together so you don't get a bunch of wobbling if you were to torque the opposing sides. So the downside of this is that it's going to be less breathable, this rigid material where the porosity is a little bit lower, despite being still a fine mesh, and then the upside is that structural strength. That comes off in a similar fashion to the side panels. Definitely shouldn't be used as a handle or to lift the case, and that mesh top has to be removed prior to removing the locking front pillar, as there's a nub of plastic on the top panel that interfaces with the pillar. And that's this pillar that we removed earlier. So this pillar has the same two toolless latches we were talking about. They work great, very easy to use, and it's a sturdy mechanism. It ends up being, again, a structural component when it's installed, and getting it out of the way is primarily just for access to the motherboard during the build process. So you can see with all this stuff removed, we have fairly full access to everything, especially if installing the video card last. So you get the motherboard in, you have good access to the back of the board when the video card's not in there. It's pretty easy to build in this case. The motherboard drops into place below the power supply pretty easily, and it leaves plenty of room to connect the various cables required around the motherboard. The pre-installed power cables are flexible, and the CPU 8-pin is extremely short, which is mostly a good thing here. They know roughly where EPS 12-volt connectors will land. They provide the power supply, so they can reduce the cabling slack to clean up the interior. Moving to cable management, we thought the NCORE 100 Max gave us enough room to tuck the cables out of the way, and it has tie-down points everywhere. So we appreciated these features given the small space and thought that they were well thought out by Cooler Master. They did a good job with the cable routing options. CPU cooler installation is standard for a CLC and includes a tube of thermal paste that looks generous, but isn't. There's only a tiny amount of paste actually in it once you peel the deceptive sticker back. It's not like it's less than what you get in small 1-gram tubes, but it definitely feels a lot worse given the misleading size of the syringe. Moving on to fitment and GPU installation. Installing GPUs up to 337 millimeters long, 180 millimeters tall, and 62 millimeters, or about 3 slots thick, is supported out of the box. The case gives a good deal of access to the GPU side, and we don't have any real complaints about the process, but just be aware that the more you fill the actual GPU space, the more challenging it'll be from a thermal standpoint, because it's starting to fill more volume internally, of course, but then also the proximity of the fans to the side panel is going to impact the pressure, where it'll need more pressure to overcome that panel if it's pushed right up against it. And additionally, there's really nowhere for flow-through to go. So in this cooler, which is a Founders Edition style, there's that fan back there, as many of you know. It's pulling air through, and it's going straight into this wall. So unfortunately, we're not really able to leverage the benefits of the modern flow-through design for a video card cooler, because it's just blowing straight into a wall where the power supply is on the opposite side or the motherboard is down here. And so what's going to end up happening is this fan, for the most part, will be responsible for pulling that air out. But there's going to be a little bit of a power struggle for cooling for where all the air is going to go coming into the side panel between straight into the exhaust fan versus through the flow-through. Now, another reason that back fan is important is because even though the pump and the block for the closed-loop liquid cooler are obviously mounted to the CPU, because it's at the top of the case, it's sort of sharing the total cooling capacity of the radiator with the power supply, which is exhausting up and out. So you can see the holes there indicating where that air is going. And also with the GPU for whatever isn't taken away by this rear fan. So in this case, this fan does not blow all the way through. It's going to sort of spread in a spiral around, and we've shown that in some of our Schlieren photography in the past. So that'll just sort of spread around inside the case. It'll find its way out the panels a little bit. Some of it will get sucked out here, and then some of it will circulate around. The flow-through is going to split most likely through the top and the back, so it's going to contribute a little bit to the processor temperature, just because the actual radiator temperature and liquid temperature will be a little bit elevated by the fact that they're sharing a cooling solution indirectly. GPUs thicker than 62 millimeters require converting the case to expanded mode. So that's done first by removing the rear corner pillar by taking out 2 screws. There's no latches on that one. And then 1 set of case feet are repositioned to a wider stance before reattaching the rear pillar into an outer position. After that, the top panel is replaced with the wider alternative included in the accessory box. This is, we think, a clever design because it mostly relies on reconfiguration rather than extra parts, and it doesn't disturb the aesthetics of the case really at all. To accommodate graphics cards longer than 337 millimeters, the PCIe bracket and the riser have to be relocated to a lower position. We assume the only reason this isn't the standard configuration is because it reduces the space available for display cables underneath the case. Having the case set up in expanded mode plus the lower bracket position allows for GPUs 357 millimeters long, 180 mm tall, and 79 millimeters thick, which Cooler Master calls 3.9 slots. And the enormous Gigabyte Aorus Master RTX 4080 is barely able to squeeze inside, inadvertently becoming a structural beam in the process. The NCORE 100 Max comes with a 90-degree 12-volt high power cable pre-installed, which is marked as only being capable of 450 watts, meaning no raising the power limit on the 4090, or technically using one with a VBIOS that boosts it higher than default. The 450 watt spec is concerning regarding cable quality, and we don't like that it presses against the central spine when used in our 4070 FE card, plus the bend and contortion that we get routing it. For GPUs that don't use 12-volt high power, Cooler Master includes 3 PCIe 8-pin cables in the accessory box. One thing we spotted was a hidden feature that's not documented in the manual at all, and that is this thin removable panel to the left of the motherboard I/O, and we were speculating that this is probably a consideration Cooler Master had to make it possible to shift the spine slightly to allow for more space in some configurations. So we sent an email over to Cooler Master with the question, and they confirmed. They said, yes, the removable plate near motherboard I/O is for making it adjustable. At first, we wanted to keep air cooling mode for non-max versions, since it can extend 17 millimeters for 3.9 slots GPUs. Shifting the motherboard tray 1 slot can make NCORE 100 support up to 67.3 millimeter air cooling height with 2.9 slot GPU support. The reason Cooler Master doesn't call out that capability is because there's currently no non-max version of this case, and there's no plan for one that we're aware of at this time. So, in other words, the spine can be adjusted, but there's not really a point to doing it right now. Okay, so that's kind of the build section. Now we're going to get into the thermals and acoustics for the case. We'll be testing this case primarily against itself in various alternative configurations, and especially since it includes its own cooling solution, we will mostly be tweaking the panels that are on the case and the configuration of the video card for testing. We've locked the 13600K to fixed frequencies and power levels for all these tests, and we set the fan on the 4070 Founders Edition to a static 44%. As usual, these temperatures are represented as delta T over ambient. Remember that all of this is comparative. The component temperature will change based on your fan speeds and your components, the voltage of those parts, what's set to auto versus controlled, and so on. Our testing is highly controlled. It's designed to evaluate how much various layouts of the case and its panels affect airflow. CPU thermals are first. Here's the chart. The GPU fan speed is unchanged in all tests, so references to fan speed are for the included fans with the case and the cooler. With the fans at 100% speed and in the stock smaller configuration, the P-cores averaged 50 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient at steady state, or 45 for all cores averaged. Removing the top panel was an experiment to look into just how much impedance that panel was causing, similar to our front panel removal tests on ATX cases. That dropped the temperature to about 47 degrees over ambient, illustrating that the panel does get in the way, but not enough to ruin performance. Moving the GPU to the outer position had no meaningful impact on CPU thermals here and was within variance. We also ran a test with the cooler closer to 27 dBA for the total configuration. That's as evaluated in our hemi-anechoic chamber with a noise floor of about 13.6 dBA during the testing. That'd have us running in the 80s after factoring in ambient, so there's still some room for quieter configurations if running a mid-range CPU like an i5, but again, you'd struggle with the 14900K when it's at 300 watts. This test helps show there's some scaling room in the cooler despite being a 120mm solution, but it's still ultimately going to be limited by size. This chart is for the GPU temperature in the same test. In this one, the stock configuration had the GPU at 51 degrees Celsius over ambient when tested with our fixed fan speeds. We didn't change the GPU fan speed when dropping the case and cooler fan speeds, but as they're the only fans circulating externally, they of course affected GPU thermals and led to a 3-degree increase. Removing the top panel posted marginal improvement, while shifting the GPU to the outer position was the most beneficial. This isn't nearly as much change as we saw on the A4H2O though, where moving the GPU shaved nearly 7 degrees Celsius off the core load temperature. What this tells us is that the NCORE 100 Max is better at removing the warm exhaust air behind the GPU by default than the A4H2O is without moving the card. All that said, this move is only possible with GPUs thin enough to sit in that outer position with or without the case expansion. So wrapping it up, it's very easy to build in. We thought the ease of installation was a good factor for this case. The toolless focus outside of the motherboard and GPU mounting was good. We thought some of the solutions like this in particular to enable the expansion of the case into the larger configuration, we thought those were put together in a clever way that minimizes the amount of additional parts they put in an accessories box that you'll inevitably put on a shelf and never use again after you first build it. So having a lower count of useless accessories in one of two configurations is a good thing because they're able to make use of the same two side panels despite expanding things without really creating any big gaps or holes in the case in the process. So we thought it was cleverly mechanically designed. For the looks, that's totally up to you, how you feel about it. It is a small footprint physically on the desk surface. It's just tall. GPU I/O at the bottom is not convenient, but because you're probably only plugging in monitors maybe once or whenever you upgrade, it seems fine as far as trade-offs go. It's definitely better than having the motherboard USB less accessible. So that's maybe a criticism, but one that you're not going to run into too often. For the CLC, so the 120 mil liquid cooler was able to keep up with the 13600K at our fixed clocks and voltages. It's just not something we would recommend for, say, a 14900K or anything higher power like that. It's going to struggle to keep up, and especially as you increase the GPU capability and the GPU heat inside of the case with an increase in the CPU heat, it's going to overwhelm this cooler. So you will need to spec the CPU more in the mid-range side of things. AMD CPUs consume a lot less power right now for similar gaming performance. So if you're building a gaming PC, you do something like a 7800X3D, you're going to be fine. It's just those hotter configurations that are problematic. So like a 7950X or anything from Intel's 14700K, 14900K, stuff like that. The GPU compatibility we thought was great. It fits pretty much anything. The cabling, the 12-volt high power cable, we really didn't like just in general how it bends, or that it's one of the lower rated cables, and you wouldn't want to raise the power limit on a 4090 given the spec of the cable. The pricing's a little tricky because it's $400, but you get two of the other components. From one ITX perspective, that's kind of taking away part of the fun. We don't get to configure the power supply or the cooler, and you don't really get to install them in the same way. So whether that matters to you is maybe dependent on how much you enjoy the process of speccing every single part and building the entire thing from scratch. But from a pure pricing perspective, again, you could kind of think of the case cost as being more equivalent to maybe about 180 bucks once you look at the price of a comparable power supply and cooler. So overall, we liked working with the case. This is better than the old Fantex Shift, was it the Evolve or whatever it was, but they had that tower case, which could position liquid coolers in not great layouts. But this one does get the pump below the radiator, so that's good. That's a healthy position for the pump to be in. We don't have any concerns about longevity beyond whatever this particular cooler might be rated for anyway. And so the biggest considerations for you ultimately are just going to be the CPU choice and making sure it's something that'll fit within your constrained options for cooling. And then again, they have a small panel that you can remove that maybe indicates a future non-max option that could be done with air cooling instead. So that's it for this review. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. Check out the other ITX reviews on the channel. We have the Terra, the Dan Case A4H2O, and we're working on a couple more right now, so a lot more coming for ITX. And as always, you can support us directly by going to store.gamersnexus.net and grabbing one of these shirts that are on sale there now. We are selling through them pretty fast, and we'll see you all next time.